Today, we're diving deep into the life of Jephthé, a man whose journey took him from being abandoned as a child to rising as one of Israel's most notable judges. Have you ever felt rejected, only to discover that your greatest strength comes from overcoming that very rejection? That's exactly what happened in Jephté's life. Stick around, because this story is full of raw emotion, fierce battles, controversial decisions, and life-changing vows. In this video, we'll explore every twist and turn of Jephté's journey. We'll look at the world he grew up in, the challenges he faced as an outcast, his unexpected rise to power, the infamous vow he made in a moment of desperation, and the lasting legacy he left behind. Whether you're new to Bible stories or a long-time follower of these timeless tales, you're in for a treat. So grab a cup of coffee, settle in, and let's explore the incredible complex story of Jephthé. Imagine yourself stepping back in time to ancient Israel, a land of rugged hills, sprawling deserts, and a people whose lives were as unpredictable as the weather. This was the era of the judges, a time when there was no central government or king to steer the nation. Instead, Israel was a patchwork of tribes, each governed by its own customs and leaders. In these days, chaos often reigned, and the people had to rely on the strength of a warrior or a wise elder to restore order. Back then, honor and reputation weren't just abstract ideas, they were the very currency of survival. Family lineage and social standing played huge roles in determining your place in society. If you were born into a respected clan, doors would open for you. But if your family name was tarnished, or you were born out of wedlock, you could expect rejection and isolation. This wasn't a modern concept of keeping up appearances, but a matter of life and death, of trust and loyalty, in a world that could be brutally unforgiving. The customs of the time were often harsh by today's standards. For example, vows and sacrifices were common practices intended to secure divine favor in times of crisis. When a leader made a promise to God, it wasn't taken lightly. The success of a battle or the fate of an entire tribe could depend on that promise. In the period of the judges, Israel was frequently under threat from neighboring nations. The absence of a central authority meant that every tribe had to fend for itself, and conflicts both between and outside the tribes were a constant reality. This lack of unity often led to internal strife, making it all the more necessary for a strong leader to emerge from the chaos. Judges weren't merely legal arbitrators, they were military commanders, spiritual guides, and symbols of hope for a beleaguered people. They were expected to be both fierce in battle and just in their rulings, an almost impossible balance to achieve given the turbulent circumstances. The cultural landscape of ancient Israel was defined by a strong sense of identity tied to tradition and divine destiny. The Israelites believed that they were chosen by God, and this belief both unified and divided them. On one hand, it provided a powerful source of pride and purpose. On the other, it set an incredibly high standard for leadership and moral behavior. The concept of divine intervention was woven into every aspect of life. From the blessing of a new harvest to the outcome of a battle, nothing happened by accident. Every success or failure was seen as a sign of God's favor or displeasure. Religion, too, was central to everyday life. The ritual observances, sacrifices, and vows made to secure divine help were more than ceremonial acts. They were seen as necessary for survival. In times of desperation, it wasn't uncommon for a leader to make a vow that could demand a heavy price. The people believed that if you honored your promise, God would ensure victory or provide for your needs. Conversely, breaking a vow or making a rash promise could invite disaster upon yourself and your community. This intense religious fervor contributed to the moral complexity of the time. Leaders had to be cautious, for every word and every promise could carry a weight that might alter the course of history. Social customs in ancient Israel were also marked by a deep respect for tradition and family honor. The extended family was the primary unit of society, and its reputation was considered paramount. Any deviation from accepted norms, such as being born to a woman with a questionable background, could have lifelong consequences. These cultural values meant that even before anyone could prove themselves on the battlefield, they were judged by their lineage. And yet, paradoxically, it was in these very circumstances that some of Israel's most unexpected heroes emerged. Outcasts, rebels, and those who had been shunned by society sometimes found that their experiences on the fringes gave them the toughness and resilience needed to face the challenges of a lawless land. Tribal affiliation was another critical element of the era's social fabric. The various tribes of Israel each had their own customs, leaders, and rivalries. This decentralized structure often meant that conflict was inevitable, both among the tribes themselves and against external enemies. The people's constant struggle for survival required not only physical strength, but also the ability to unite disparate groups under a common cause. In this context, the role of a judge went far beyond administering justice. A judge had to be a unifier, someone who could bring together warring factions and inspire trust even among those who had once rejected him. In summary, the historical and cultural context of ancient Israel during the time of the judges was one of fierce independence, relentless struggle, and deep-rooted traditions. It was an era defined by the interplay between divine promise and human frailty, a time when every decision was a matter of life or death. The people lived in a world where honor, loyalty, and the strength of one's convictions could either secure a legacy or lead to utter ruin. This backdrop sets the stage for the life of Jephthé, a man whose story of rejection and eventual triumph is all the more remarkable when seen against the harsh realities of his time. Jephté's story begins in one of the harshest ways imaginable, a beginning marked by rejection and isolation. Born to a woman who, by the standards of the time, was seen as less than reputable, Jephthé was never afforded the privilege of acceptance by his own family. Imagine being a child, full of life and potential, only to have the very people who should nurture and protect you cast you aside because of the circumstances of your birth. For Jephthé, this early rejection wasn't just a minor setback, it was a defining moment that shaped every aspect of his life. Growing up as an outcast in ancient Israel was no easy path. The community's disdain wasn't limited to whispered gossip, it was an active, almost institutionalized rejection. He was forced to live on the outskirts, both physically and socially, where survival depended on one's own strength and resourcefulness. Without the support of a loving family or a welcoming community, Jephthé had to learn early on how to fend for himself. Every day was a battle against hunger, prejudice, and the ever-present threat of violence from those who looked down on him. But as harsh as his early years were, they also became the crucible in which his character was forged. There's something almost poetic about the way hardship can transform a person. In Jephté's case, the constant struggle for survival instilled in him a fierce independence and an unyielding determination. He learned to trust only himself, to rely on his own skills, and to develop a sense of inner strength that few could match. Every insult and every slight pushed him to prove that he was more than what others thought of him, a sentiment that would later define his entire journey. The life of an outcast in ancient Israel wasn't merely about physical survival, it was also a profound emotional and psychological struggle. Rejection, especially from one's own family, leaves deep scars. For Jephthé, every day was a reminder that he was unwanted, that his very existence was a mistake in the eyes of those who were supposed to love him. Yet, it was precisely this sense of abandonment that drove him to excel. He refused to be defined by his origins. Instead of succumbing to bitterness, he channeled his pain into a relentless drive to prove his worth. His early life became a series of lessons in perseverance, each setback a stepping stone toward the man he would eventually become. As he grew older, Jephthé's reputation as a fighter began to spread. Living on the fringes of society meant that he had to rely on his own wits and physical prowess. It wasn't long before his natural abilities on the battlefield became apparent. Stories started to circulate about the young man who, despite his troubled beginnings, could hold his own against much stronger opponents. In a time when strength and courage were the most highly prized virtues, Jephthé's exploits began to change the narrative. The very qualities that had once made him an outcast, his fierce independence, his willingness to fight for survival, and his unbreakable spirit, now became the traits of a burgeoning hero. There's a lesson to be learned in the way Jephthé's early hardships molded him. His life as an outcast wasn't just about loneliness and despair. It was also a powerful reminder that our origins do not dictate our destiny. In a society that judged him by birth, Jephthé's actions and achievements gradually began to speak louder than any stigma attached to his name. His ability to overcome the constant rejection and to stand tall in the face of adversity became the foundation for his later successes. Every trial he faced as a child, every moment of isolation, prepared him for the moment when his nation would need someone to lead them out of darkness. Living on the outskirts of society also meant that Jephthé developed a deep understanding of the struggles faced by those who were marginalized. He came to know what it meant to be truly alone in a world that offered no safety net. This empathy for the downtrodden, combined with his own personal experiences of rejection, would later become a key element of his leadership. It gave him a unique perspective on the value of every human life and the importance of fighting for those who had been cast aside. Even when he rose to a position of power, the echoes of his lonely childhood remained with him, a constant reminder of the cost of neglect and the transformative power of compassion, born out of hardship. In essence, the early life of Jephthé is a story of survival against all odds. It is the story of a boy who, despite being labeled as unworthy before he could even speak for himself, learned to harness the pain of rejection and turn it into a driving force. His life on the fringes of society was marked by struggle, but it also laid the groundwork for the extraordinary resilience that would define his later years. Every battle he fought as a child, every insult he endured, every moment of isolation, became a lesson in perseverance. And in those harsh lessons, Jephthé discovered a strength that would eventually enable him not only to survive, but to become a leader who could rally an entire nation. As Israel's troubles mounted, a remarkable transformation began to take place. A transformation that would see Jephthé, once the ultimate outcast, rise to become a judge and a deliverer for his people. The nation was in chaos. With enemies encroaching from every side and internal divisions tearing communities apart, the desperate Israelites were crying out for a savior. It was in this crucible of crisis that Jephté's long-hidden potential was finally recognized. News of Jephté's exploits on the battlefield had begun to spread far and wide. What started as whispers among the tribes grew into a resounding call for help. Even those who had once scorned him for his lowly origins were forced to confront a stark reality. The man they had dismissed was now proving to be one of the most formidable warriors in the land. His reputation as a fierce and cunning fighter, forged in the fires of rejection and hardship, could no longer be ignored. In a time when military might was paramount, his strength and skill became exactly what Israel needed. The elders and leaders of the Israelite tribes, desperate to fend off the encroaching enemy, began to see that true leadership was not a matter of pedigree or birthright. It was about capability, courage, and the ability to inspire hope in even the darkest of times. Jephthé, with his unyielding determination and battle-hardened resolve, emerged as the unlikely candidate. Slowly, the very people who had once cast him aside began to rally behind him. His past as an outcast was gradually overshadowed by his present achievements on the battlefield. When Jephthé was finally chosen to serve as a judge, it wasn't just a military appointment, it was a moment of profound transformation for both him and the nation. His rise to leadership symbolized a turning point for Israel. No longer was the measure of a person confined to the circumstances of their birth. Instead, it was defined by their actions and their ability to rise above adversity. Jephthé's appointment sent a powerful message. Sometimes the very individuals society deems unworthy have the strength and heart to lead in times of crisis. As a judge, Jephthé's responsibilities went far beyond the command of armies. He was expected to be a moral compass, a mediator, and a unifying force for a fractured people. His role required him to navigate not only the external threats posed by Israel's enemies, but also the internal divisions that had long plagued the tribes. In his leadership, there was a blend of stern decisiveness and a deep empathy born from his own experiences of rejection. He understood what it meant to be cast aside, and this understanding made him a compassionate leader, even when he had to make tough decisions. The transformation from outcast to leader was neither sudden nor easy. Jephthé had to prove himself repeatedly on the battlefield, demonstrating that his strength was not just physical, but also moral and strategic. Every victory he secured was a step toward earning the trust of a people who had once looked down on him. His military campaigns, marked by daring tactics and unwavering determination, slowly shifted the public's perception. Over time, Jephthé became not just a symbol of deliverance, but also a beacon of hope for all those who had ever felt marginalized or rejected. In his newfound role, Jephthé worked tirelessly to unite the tribes. He knew that true strength lay in solidarity. Even though Israel was a land of diverse groups with their own customs and rivalries, he endeavored to build bridges between them. His own life story, rising from the depths of rejection to the heights of leadership, served as a powerful example of what could be achieved when one refused to be limited by their past. His journey was a testament to the idea that greatness can emerge from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the very qualities that once marked you as different can become your greatest assets. Jephthé's leadership was not without its challenges. The weight of responsibility bore heavily on him. Every decision he made was scrutinized, not only by his supporters, but also by those who remembered his humble beginnings. Yet, in facing these challenges head-on, he demonstrated that leadership was not about perfection. It was about perseverance, accountability, and the willingness to learn from every setback. His own internal struggles, shaped by years of isolation and rejection, became the driving force behind his determination to succeed for the sake of his people. Under Jephthé's command, Israel experienced a brief period of stability and unity. His victories against the encroaching enemies were celebrated as miraculous deliverances, and his personal story resonated with a population that had long felt abandoned by fate. The irony was palpable. The very man whose origins were steeped in rejection had become the linchpin of national hope. In rallying the tribes together, he not only defended the land, but also redefined what it meant to be chosen, shifting the focus from ancestry and reputation to the strength of one's character and deeds. Jephthé's rise to leadership also brought about a change in how the people viewed divine intervention. In earlier times, many had assumed that God's favor rested solely with the well-born and the traditionally virtuous. But Jephthé's story challenged that notion. His ascent from outcast to judge was a living reminder that God often works through the most unlikely vessels. In a world where human judgment was harsh and unforgiving, his life became a beacon of the belief that divine grace can transform even the most forsaken individual into a leader of destiny. In the midst of all these sweeping changes, Jephthé never forgot the pain of his past. The scars of abandonment, the stinging rejection by his own kin, and the loneliness of his early years remained etched in his heart. Yet rather than allowing these wounds to fester, he used them as a source of strength. a reminder of why he had to fight, not just for his own redemption, but for the honor of every outcast and every person who had ever been underestimated. His empathy for those left on the fringes became one of his most admirable qualities, endearing him to many who had once felt voiceless and unseen. Ultimately, Jephthé's journey from being shunned to being celebrated as a judge is a story of transformation on every level. It's a narrative about how personal adversity can be alchemized into leadership qualities that uplift an entire community. It's about challenging the status quo and proving that true worth is not measured by birth or reputation, but by action, courage, and an unwavering commitment to a higher purpose. In reflecting on this remarkable journey, one can't help but be inspired by the resilience of the human spirit. Jephthé's life reminds us that even in our darkest moments, when rejection seems all-encompassing, there is always the potential for renewal and greatness. His rise to leadership stands as a powerful testament to the fact that no matter where we come from, our actions and our choices define us far more than our origins ever could. Imagine a battlefield charged with desperation, where the outcome of a war hangs on a single desperate promise. It was in such a moment that Jephthé, faced with the overwhelming might of his enemies, made a vow that would forever change his life and the destiny of those closest to him. In the midst of a fierce battle against the Ammonites, Jephthé declared that if victory were granted, he would offer as a sacrifice whatever or whoever first greeted him upon his triumphant return. At first glance, this vow might seem like nothing more than a rash promise made in the heat of battle. However, it quickly became a turning point that has intrigued and troubled scholars, theologians, and believers for centuries. The context in which this vow was made is crucial to understanding its impact. In ancient Israel, vows were a common way to secure divine favor. Leaders and warriors alike would promise sacrifices to God as a way to ensure success in their endeavors. In a society where every military victory was seen as a sign of God's favor, Jephthé's vow was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader cultural and religious practice. Yet, what makes his vow so controversial is not its form, but its content, and the devastating consequences that followed. At the moment Jephthé uttered his promise, the air was thick with tension. The battle against the Ammonites was not just a fight for territory, it was a struggle for the survival of Israel itself. Jephthé, a man who had long been rejected by society, now found himself shouldering the hopes of an entire nation. With his back against the wall, he offered up a vow that he believed would secure God's intervention. The promise was simple. If God granted him victory, the first person to greet him upon his return would be offered as a burnt offering. In the fervor of battle, it was easy to understand why such a desperate measure might be considered. But as history would have it, the first to greet him was none other than his own daughter. The shock of this outcome cannot be overstated. In one heartbeat, a promise made under duress turned into a personal tragedy that would forever stain Jephthé's legacy. The vow forced him into a moral dilemma that still challenges our understanding of leadership and faith. How could a man, already burdened by a painful past and hardened by a life of struggle, make a promise that would cost him dearly on a personal level? Was it simply a mistake born of desperation? Or was there a deeper cultural or even symbolic meaning behind his words? Some modern interpretations suggest that Jephthé's vow might have been intended as a symbolic act rather than a literal one, a hyperbolic way of demonstrating his total commitment to God and the cause of his people. In this view, the vow was meant to express that nothing was more important than victory over the Ammonites, and that he would accept any sacrifice, even if the cost was unthinkable, to secure that triumph. Yet regardless of the intention, the tragic fulfillment of the vow remains an enduring part of his story. For many, the tragic outcome highlights a timeless truth about human nature. In moments of extreme crisis, our decisions can be both bold and deeply flawed. Jephthé's promise illustrates how a leader's desire for success can lead to a cascade of irreversible consequences. It also forces us to ask, what would we have done in his shoes? Imagine being so desperate for deliverance that you commit to an act that, if carried through, would bring unimaginable personal loss. The weight of such a decision is something that resonates even in our modern lives, where impulsive promises, though rarely as drastic, can lead to outcomes we never intended. In discussing this vow, it is also important to consider the cultural context of ancient vows and sacrifices. In Jephthé's time, such commitments were often made under the belief that human actions, when sealed by a solemn promise, had the power to influence divine will. Leaders were expected to be both bold and unyielding in their commitment to God, even if that meant making sacrifices that, by today's standards, might seem extreme or even barbaric. This cultural framework helped shape the way the vow was perceived by those around him and has influenced its interpretation throughout the centuries. The emotional turmoil experienced by Jephthé in the wake of his vow is palpable when you listen to his story. Imagine the agony of realizing that the very promise you made to secure victory might demand a sacrifice from the person you hold dearest. The conflict between his duty to his nation and his personal grief is a heart-wrenching reminder that even the strongest among us are vulnerable to the consequences of our own words. The vow became a turning point, not only in the military campaign against the Ammonites, but also in Jephthé's own internal journey, a moment where triumph and tragedy collided. Over the years, many have debated whether the vow should be seen purely as a tragic mistake or as an inevitable outcome of the extreme pressures placed upon a leader during desperate times. Some argue that it reflects the harsh realities of a society in which honor, sacrifice, and divine favor were inextricably linked. Others see it as an example of the dangerous consequences of making promises without fully understanding their implications, a lesson as relevant today as it was in ancient times. Regardless of the interpretation, the controversial vow remains one of the most poignant and discussed episodes in Jephthé's life. It also prompts us to reflect on the nature of leadership. Leaders are often placed in positions where every decision is amplified, where personal sacrifice is intertwined with public duty. Jephthé's vow forces us to confront the idea that true leadership may sometimes demand choices that are as morally ambiguous as they are necessary. The conflict between personal affection and public responsibility is one that many leaders can relate to, and it raises important questions about the limits of what we are willing to sacrifice in pursuit of a greater good. Ultimately, the controversial vow stands as a stark reminder of the heavy burden that comes with leadership. It is a moment frozen in time, a turning point that not only changed the course of a battle, but also altered the trajectory of Jephthé's life forever. The vow, with all its complexity and tragedy, forces us to examine our own impulses and the weight of the promises we make. It challenges us to think deeply about the consequences of our actions and to recognize that even in moments of triumph, there can be a hidden cost. Jephthé's legacy is a study in contrasts, a blend of undeniable heroism and profound personal tragedy that has resonated through the ages. On one side, he is remembered as a deliverer, a courageous leader who rose from the margins of society to protect and guide his people during a time of existential crisis. On the other side, his life is forever marred by the tragic fulfillment of his controversial vow, a decision that cost him dearly on a personal level and cast a long shadow over his achievements. For many in Israel, Jephthé's military victories were nothing short of miraculous. In a time when the nation was fractured and besieged by enemies, his leadership provided a beacon of hope. Stories of his daring exploits on the battlefield spread rapidly among the tribes, gradually transforming public opinion. The same people who once scorned him for his origins began to see him as a symbol of resilience and strength, a living testament to the idea that greatness can emerge from even the most unlikely circumstances. His ability to rally disparate groups, forge alliances, and lead his people to victory against formidable foes earned him a revered place in the annals of Israelite history. Yet, as time passed, the bright image of the warrior judge was inextricably linked to the darker memory of his vow. For many, the legacy of Jephthé is a dual one, marked by the heroism of his military campaigns and the enduring sorrow of the sacrifice demanded by his promise. This tragic element of his story has spurred endless debate among scholars, theologians, and lay readers alike. Was the vow a grave error, a misstep in judgment that doomed him to personal loss? Or was it a necessary, albeit tragic, element of a larger narrative about divine justice and human frailty? The heroism attributed to Jephthé is not merely found in his battlefield successes, but also in his ability to overcome the stigma of his past. In a society where one's birth and family name could determine your entire destiny, Jephté's rise to power is a powerful reminder that our actions and character can defy even the most entrenched social prejudices. His story inspires countless individuals who have felt marginalized or rejected, offering a message that your beginnings do not have to dictate your future. For those who have struggled against adversity, his life is a testament to the transformative power of resilience and determination. But the legacy of Jephthé is also a cautionary tale. The memory of his controversial vow serves as a reminder that even the mightiest of heroes can be vulnerable to their own flaws. The tragic outcome of that promise, the loss of his daughter, casts a long shadow over his otherwise commendable achievements. It forces us to confront the reality that leadership is often accompanied by personal sacrifice, and that the pressures of command can sometimes lead to decisions with irreversible consequences. This duality is at the heart of Jephté's legacy. He is celebrated for his deliverance of Israel, yet his story is inextricably linked to the sorrow of a promise that went too far. In reflecting on Jephté's legacy, one cannot ignore the enduring impact his life has had on subsequent generations. Throughout history, his story has been used as both an inspiration and a warning. For some, he stands as an icon of redemption, a man who, despite a troubled and ignoble beginning, rose to perform great deeds for his people. For others, he is a symbol of the cost of impulsive decisions, a tragic figure whose personal loss underscores the heavy price that leadership can exact. This dual image is reflected in countless sermons, writings, and discussions over the centuries, with each generation finding in his story both hope and caution. Many modern interpreters draw parallels between Jephthé and other historical or literary figures who have similarly navigated the tension between public triumph and personal tragedy. His life is often compared to that of heroes who must bear the burden of difficult choices, figures whose legacies are marked not only by their victories, but also by the personal sacrifices they were forced to make. In this light, Jephthé becomes more than just a biblical character. He transforms into a universal symbol of the human condition. His story speaks to anyone who has ever had to choose between duty and personal cost, between the demands of leadership and the needs of the heart. The way in which Jephté's legacy is remembered also highlights the complexity of our relationship with history. His achievements on the battlefield provided a fleeting period of stability and hope for a nation in turmoil, yet his personal life was irrevocably altered by the vow that cost him dearly. This inherent contradiction invites us to explore the paradoxes of leadership. How can one be celebrated for heroic deeds while simultaneously bearing the burden of a tragic personal loss? It is this very paradox that makes Jephté's legacy so enduring and so resonant. His story reminds us that greatness is often accompanied by pain, and that the path to true leadership is paved with both victory and sacrifice. In many ways, the legacy of Jephthé challenges us to rethink our definitions of success and heroism. Is a leader defined solely by his achievements on the battlefield, or is he equally, if not more, defined by the personal sacrifices he endures in the name of duty? For Jephthé, the answer is not clear-cut. His military conquests and his ability to unite a divided people are celebrated in the historical record, yet his personal grief, the loss of his daughter, the weight of a promise that still haunts the pages of Scripture, remains a stark counterpoint to his public triumphs. This duality forces us to ask difficult questions about the nature of leadership, responsibility, and the human cost of our decisions. The legacy of Jephthé is also a call to introspection. It asks us to consider the consequences of our own promises and the impact our decisions may have on those we love. His tragic vow stands as a potent symbol of the dangers inherent in making decisions under pressure without fully considering the potential fallout. In our own lives, while we may never face such extreme circumstances, we are all called upon at times to make decisions that carry unforeseen consequences. Jephté's story, then, serves as a powerful reminder to approach our commitments with caution, to weigh our words carefully, and to recognize that even in the pursuit of a noble goal, the price of success may be higher than we anticipate. Ultimately, the legacy of Jephthé is a blend of triumph and sorrow, a narrative that celebrates the indomitable spirit of a man who defied the odds, while also mourning the personal cost of his choices. His story endures because it is a mirror, reflecting the complexities of the human experience, the joy of victory intermingled with the pain of loss, the brilliance of leadership shadowed by the burdens of responsibility. It is a legacy that continues to inspire and provoke, inviting each new generation to learn from the past and to consider how best to balance the demands of duty with the needs of the heart. Beyond the historical and personal narrative lies a deeper, more philosophical layer to Jephté's story, a layer that explores the interplay between divine destiny and human choice. The theological and allegorical themes woven into his life have sparked extensive discussion, offering insights that go far beyond the literal events recorded in the Scriptures. In many ways, Jephté's life is a canvas upon which the tensions between fate and free will, sacrifice and redemption, and divine favor versus human frailty are vividly painted. One of the most striking theological questions raised by Jephté's story is the nature of divine intervention. Throughout the Bible, God's favor is often seen as the catalyst for victory, a force that turns the tide in the face of overwhelming odds. Jephté's rise from outcast to judge is itself a testament to this idea. A man rejected by society becomes the instrument through which divine will is manifested. Yet, his infamous vow introduces a critical nuance into this narrative. It forces us to ask, if God is so generous as to deliver a people from their enemies, why would he allow a leader to be ensnared by a promise that results in such personal tragedy? This tension between the benevolence of divine intervention and the harsh reality of human consequence lies at the heart of many theological debates. Many interpreters see Jephté's vow as emblematic of the broader struggle between destiny and free will. On one hand, his rise to power seems predestined, a clear sign that God works through even the most unlikely vessels. On the other hand, the disastrous outcome of his promise underscores the reality that human beings are fallible, prone to making decisions that can alter the course of their lives in unexpected ways. This duality invites us to reflect on our own lives. How much of our destiny is predetermined, and how much is shaped by the choices we make? In the story of Jephthé, we find a powerful allegory for the complex dance between fate and free will. A reminder that while divine providence may set the stage, it is ultimately our decisions that write our stories. Another important theological theme in Jephté's narrative is the concept of sacrifice. In ancient Israel, the act of sacrifice was not merely a ritual, it was a tangible expression of commitment, an offering made to secure divine favor in times of need. Jephté's vow and its tragic fulfillment bring the notion of sacrifice into sharp focus. Here, sacrifice is not portrayed as a noble act of devotion alone, but as a double-edged sword, a means of attaining victory that may exact a steep personal price. The loss incurred through his vow challenges the simplistic idea that sacrifice is always virtuous. Instead, it presents a more complicated picture, one in which the line between noble self-offering and tragic self-destruction is perilously thin. This ambiguity forces us to grapple with difficult questions about the true cost of our commitments and the responsibilities we bear when we call upon a higher power. The allegorical dimensions of Jephthé's story extend even further when we consider the symbolic roles played by the key figures in his life. For many theologians, Jephthé represents not just a historical figure, but an archetype, a man whose life embodies the struggle for redemption amid human imperfection. His rise to leadership, despite his troubled origins, mirrors the idea that God's grace is available to all, regardless of social status or past transgressions. In this light, Jephthé becomes a symbol of hope for those who have been marginalized, a living example that divine purpose can be found even in the most unlikely places. Yet, the tragic consequences of his vow add a sobering counterpoint to this hopeful narrative. They serve as a stark warning about the perils of unconsidered promises, a reminder that while divine grace may uplift us, it does not shield us from the natural consequences of our own actions. This tension between divine mercy and human responsibility is a theme that recurs throughout Scripture, challenging believers to consider the balance between trusting in God's plan and taking responsibility for one's own choices. For contemporary audiences, the theological and allegorical themes in Jephthé's story continue to hold a powerful relevance. They encourage us to reflect on our own lives, to examine the promises we make, whether to ourselves, to others, or to a higher power, and to recognize that every decision carries with it both the possibility of redemption and the risk of unforeseen loss. In a world where quick fixes and impulsive decisions are all too common, the cautionary tale of Jephthé's vow reminds us that every commitment should be made with care and thoughtful reflection. Furthermore, Jephthé's narrative opens up broader discussions about the nature of leadership and the intersection of personal sacrifice with public duty. His story challenges us to think about what it truly means to lead. Is it enough to secure victories and restore order? Or must a leader also bear the scars of personal loss and regret? The theological reflections embedded in his life compel us to acknowledge that the path of leadership is rarely free of hardship, that every act of service, no matter how noble, may come with its own hidden costs. In the end, the theological and allegorical themes found in the story of Jephthé resonate deeply because they speak to universal truths about the human condition. They remind us that while we may strive for greatness and seek divine favor, we are always bound by the limits of our own humanity. Jephthé's life, with its mix of triumph and tragedy, is a mirror in which we can see our own hopes, fears, and the difficult choices that shape our destiny. By engaging with these themes, we are invited to look beyond the literal events of the past and to draw lessons that are applicable in our modern lives. Whether it's the reminder to think carefully before making a promise, the understanding that our flaws are part of what makes us human, or the recognition that true leadership requires both strength and vulnerability, Jephthé's story offers insights that continue to speak to us across the centuries. In conclusion, to theological and allegorical, Jephthé's narrative ultimately teaches us that the interplay between destiny and choice is as old as time itself. His life is a testament to the fact that while divine plans may guide us, the decisions we make, often in moments of desperation, carry consequences that can echo throughout our lives. His story challenges us to balance our ambitions with our responsibilities, to seek divine guidance without neglecting our own judgment, and to recognize that the price of our promises may sometimes be higher than we ever imagined. Through the lens of theology and allegory, Jephthé becomes more than a character from ancient scripture. He embodies the struggle between the ideal and the real, between what we hope to achieve and what we are ultimately willing to sacrifice. In a world that often demands perfection, his very human imperfections become a powerful reminder that our journeys are fraught with both beauty and sorrow, and that it is in our struggle to reconcile these forces that true wisdom is found. When we turn our attention to the biblical text itself, the story of Jephthé invites us into a rich field of study that has engaged scholars for centuries. The primary account of his life is found in Judges 11, a passage that has been interpreted in many different ways over time. Let's begin by unpacking the text from a close reading perspective, exploring both its literal narrative and the deeper meanings that have been drawn out by biblical exegesis. At its most basic level, Judges 11 presents Jephthé as a man marked by contradictions, a fierce warrior and a tragic figure whose personal vow leads to an unbearable loss. The text is terse, yet laden with detail. It tells us that Jephthé was scorned because of his illegitimate birth, that he became a leader when the Ammonite threat loomed large, and that in his desperation, he made a vow that ended in heartbreak. Early interpreters noted the stark nature of this narrative, with the figure of Jephthé emerging as both a deliverer and as a cautionary example of hasty promises. One of the most debated passages is the description of the vow itself. The original Hebrew language contains nuances that modern readers may miss. The term used for vow, nadar, connotes not only a promise, but also a solemn binding commitment before God. Many scholars emphasize that in the cultural context of ancient Israel, such vows were not taken lightly. They were a way of sealing one's fate in the hope of securing divine intervention. However, the tragic fulfillment of this vow, in which the first thing that greeted Jephthé on his return was his daughter, raises profound ethical and theological questions. Some scholars argue that the vow was meant to be symbolic, a hyperbolic expression of Jephthé's total commitment to victory over the Ammonites. They suggest that he may have intended a figurative interpretation, one where sacrifice was meant to signify a total and irreversible commitment, rather than an actual human offering. Others, however, contend that the vow was to be taken literally, and that its fulfillment was meant to underscore the dire consequences of rash promises made under extreme pressure. Over the years, various commentaries have examined this tension, with some suggesting that the text may have even undergone later redaction to heighten its dramatic impact. Beyond the vow, biblical scholars have also examined Jephthé's rise to leadership. His story appears in the broader narrative of the Judges, a period when Israel's leadership was decentralized and individual figures emerged to deliver the people from crisis. In this context, Jephthé's transformation from outcast to judge is emblematic of a recurring biblical motif: God's favor resting on those whom society rejects. This theme resonates throughout the scriptures. From Moses, who was raised in Pharaoh's household yet became the liberator of the Israelites, to David, a shepherd boy who became king. In the case of Jephthé, his personal history of rejection and marginalization is used to illustrate that divine purpose often transcends human social conventions. Scholars have also engaged with the narrative structure and stylistic features of Judges 11. The text is marked by a distinctive rhythm and symmetry, a structure that some commentators compare to ancient Near Eastern epic poetry. The repeated contrasts between Jephthe's lowly origins and his later military successes serve to heighten the dramatic irony of his story. In this light, his personal tragedy is not simply a lapse in judgment, but a carefully constructed narrative device that highlights the cost of leadership in turbulent times. Theological debates surrounding Jephthé's story have also centered on the nature of divine justice and mercy. For instance, some theologians suggest that the tragic outcome of his vow is a reminder that while God may use imperfect human beings to achieve his purposes, he does not necessarily condone every human action. In this view, Jephthé's story serves as a warning against the dangers of impulsive religious commitments. Others see the narrative as a complex interplay between divine sovereignty and human free will, where Jephthé's fallibility is part of a larger tapestry of divine redemption that includes both triumph and sorrow. One particularly intriguing aspect is how later Jewish and Christian interpretations have treated Jephthé's vow. In rabbinic literature, debates abound regarding whether the vow was truly meant to result in human sacrifice or whether it can be understood as an idiomatic expression of total consecration. Some rabbinic sources attempt to reconcile the text by suggesting that the daughter was spared or that she lived a life of perpetual mourning and dedication, thereby transforming her fate into a symbol of atonement. In Christian theology, the story has been less frequently invoked, but it still offers a potent image of the human cost of misapplied zeal. Some early church fathers saw Jephthé as a figure whose tragic mistake underscored the importance of discerning divine will from personal ambition. Another layer of scholarly insight comes from comparing various ancient translations and textual traditions. The Septuagint, for example, sometimes offers slightly different readings of key passages in Judges 11. These variations have led to lively debates among textual critics about the original intent of the narrative. Differences in the translation of certain Hebrew terms can subtly shift the tone of the story, from a straightforward account of military deliverance to a more morally ambiguous tale of human error and divine retribution. This diversity of interpretation underscores the richness of the biblical text and its capacity to speak to different generations in different ways. Modern archaeological discoveries and historical critical methods have also contributed to our understanding of Jephthé's narrative. Some scholars suggest that the story reflects historical realities of the late pre-monarchic period in Israel, a time marked by tribal strife, foreign incursions, and rapid changes in social structures. In this view, Jephthé's rise and his dramatic vow may be seen as emblematic of the unpredictable and often harsh conditions under which ancient Israelites lived. By situating Jephthé within his historical milieu, scholars can better appreciate both the extraordinary nature of his achievements and the tragic dimensions of his personal choices. Furthermore, the language of the text itself has been a subject of close examination. The Hebrew used in Judges 11 is both stark and evocative, capturing the emotional intensity of the narrative without resorting to embellishment. This economical style has led some interpreters to argue that every word and phrase is deliberately chosen to convey multiple layers of meaning. For instance, the repeated references to vows, oaths, and sacrifices in the text are seen not merely as ritualistic details, but as symbols of the deep interplay between faith and human responsibility. Such linguistic analysis reveals that the story of Jephthé is as much about the power of language and promise as it is about the historical events it records. In sum, the biblical exegesis of Jephthé's story has evolved over centuries, from early literal interpretations to more nuanced, multi-layered readings that incorporate historical, linguistic, and theological insights. What remains constant is the enduring fascination with a man who, despite his ignoble beginnings and the heavy burden of his vow, emerges as a figure of both deliverance and deep personal loss. For modern audiences, these scholarly insights offer a way to engage with an ancient text that is at once historical and profoundly human. They invite us to consider the ways in which our own promises, our own moments of desperate decision, might echo across time in ways we never anticipated. Moving beyond the confines of the biblical text, it's enlightening to consider Jephthé's story within the broader spectrum of ancient literature. Across the ancient Near East and beyond, stories of outcasts who rise to power, leaders who make fateful vows, and the tragic consequences of impulsive decisions are remarkably common. By comparing Jephthé's narrative with other ancient accounts, we can glean insights into both the universal human condition and the unique cultural context of Israel. In many ancient societies, leaders were often portrayed as figures who emerged from humble or even ignoble beginnings. In Mesopotamian literature, for example, there are accounts of heroes who, much like Jephthé, were initially marginalized or scorned, but eventually rose to positions of great authority. One notable parallel can be drawn with the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the protagonist embarks on a journey marked by both great triumphs and profound personal loss. While the tone and theological underpinnings of the Gilgamesh epic differ significantly from the biblical account, both narratives highlight the transformative power of adversity and the complex interplay between destiny and personal choice. Similarly, in ancient Egyptian literature, stories of leaders and deities often incorporate themes of sacrifice and redemption. The myth of Osiris, for instance, involves betrayal, death, and eventual resurrection, a cycle that reflects both the inevitability of loss and the hope for renewal. Although the cultural and religious contexts differ greatly from those of ancient Israel, the underlying motif, the price of leadership and the cost of divine favor, is strikingly similar. These parallels underscore that Jephthé's story is not an isolated case, but part of a broader narrative tradition in which great leaders are inextricably linked to both success and personal tragedy. Moving to the Greco-Roman world, we encounter another rich tradition of heroic narratives where the line between triumph and downfall is often blurred. Consider the stories of heroes like Hercules, who, despite his strength and heroic feats, was haunted by personal tragedies and moral dilemmas. Hercules' labors, like Jephthé's battles, were not just physical challenges, but also tests of character that left enduring marks on his legacy. Both figures remind us that the qualities that elevate us to greatness can also be the source of our deepest sorrows. In many respects, the comparison between Jephthé and classical heroes invites us to reflect on the timeless nature of human ambition and the inherent risks of making vows or promises under extreme circumstances. In the context of ancient Near Eastern treaties and royal inscriptions, vows and promises often played a critical role in legitimizing a ruler's authority. Kings in kingdoms such as Assyria and Babylonia frequently invoked divine support to justify their military conquests and to bind their subjects to the royal covenant. These texts reveal that the act of making a vow was not merely a personal matter, but a public, even political act that could determine the fate of an entire state. In this light, Jephthé's vow can be seen as a microcosm of a larger cultural phenomenon, a ritualized moment where personal devotion intersects with political necessity. The tragic outcome of his vow thus takes on an added layer of meaning when compared with similar practices in other ancient cultures, where the cost of ensuring divine favor was often steep and unpredictable. Another fascinating comparison arises when we examine the role of women in these ancient narratives. In many cultures, the fate of a female figure, whether as a sacrificial victim, a devoted servant, or even a redeemed heroine, reflects the values and tensions of the society in question. In Jephthé's story, the figure of his daughter, who becomes the unwitting subject of his vow, is particularly resonant. Comparable narratives can be found in the myths and legends of other cultures, where the loss or sacrifice of a beloved daughter symbolizes both personal and communal tragedy. For instance, in some versions of the story of the Canaanite goddess Ishtar, or in other fertility cults, the cyclical nature of sacrifice is portrayed as essential for the renewal of life, even as it brings inevitable sorrow. Such comparisons invite us to consider the broader symbolic significance of sacrifice in ancient thought, where personal loss was sometimes seen as the price of cosmic balance. In exploring these cross-cultural narratives, it is important to note that while many ancient stories share similar themes, each tradition also brings its own distinctive worldview and values to the table. In the case of Jephthé, the biblical narrative is deeply intertwined with the covenantal history of Israel, a history marked by both divine promise and human failure. This sets his story apart from many of its contemporaries, as it is not only a personal saga, but also a theological statement about God's dealings with his chosen people. Whereas many ancient epics focus primarily on the hero's personal journey, Jephthe's account serves as a mirror, reflecting the collective hopes, fears, and moral dilemmas of an entire nation. Comparative analysis also benefits from examining the literary style and narrative techniques employed in these ancient texts. The brevity and starkness of the biblical account of Jephthé are in sharp contrast with the elaborate poetic forms found in Mesopotamian or Greek epics. While the epic style tends to emphasize grandeur and the inevitability of fate through extended similes, catalogues of heroic deeds, and divine interventions in vivid detail, the biblical narrative opts for a more restrained and direct style. This difference in literary approach may reflect divergent cultural attitudes toward storytelling and the portrayal of human suffering. The biblical style, with its focus on moral ambiguity and the consequences of human choice, invites the reader to engage in reflection and debate, rather than simply marveling at feats of strength and valor. Moreover, the use of parallelism and repetition in the biblical text, a technique common in ancient Hebrew literature, serves to underscore the themes of promise and consequence. For example, the repeated references to vows, sacrifices, and divine retribution in Judges 11 create a rhythm that mirrors the cyclical nature of Israel's history during the time of the Judges. In contrast, many Greco-Roman texts employ a more linear narrative progression, emphasizing individual heroics over collective memory. This stylistic divergence further enriches our understanding of how different cultures conceptualized leadership, sacrifice, and the interplay between human agency and divine will. A further area of comparative interest is the question of historical veracity versus mythic embellishment. Modern scholars often debate the extent to which these ancient narratives should be read as historical records or as allegorical tales meant to convey moral truths. In the case of Jephthé, some argue that his story, like many biblical accounts, may have been shaped by later editorial revisions that sought to emphasize certain theological points. When we compare this to other ancient narratives, whether the mythic cycles of the Greeks or the annals of the Assyrian kings, we see a similar pattern of historical kernels being overlaid with layers of myth and moral interpretation. This process of myth-making is itself a subject of scholarly inquiry, one that reveals much about how ancient peoples understood the nature of history, memory, and the divine. Finally, it's worth considering how these ancient narratives continue to resonate with modern audiences. The themes of rejection, sacrifice, and the burden of leadership are as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago. In comparing Jephté's story with other ancient traditions, we find that the essential dilemmas of human existence, making promises under pressure, reconciling personal loss with public duty, and grappling with the tension between fate and free will, are timeless. Whether through the lens of biblical exegesis or through cross-cultural comparison, these stories challenge us to reflect on our own lives and the choices we make. They invite us to consider the ways in which our personal narratives are shaped not only by our triumphs, but also by our missteps, and they remind us that every promise carries with it the potential for both glory and regret. I want you to take a moment here and really think about your own experiences. Have you ever felt like an outcast or been underestimated because of where you came from? Maybe you've made a promise in a moment of passion, only to see unexpected consequences unfold later. Jephthe's story isn't just an ancient account. It's a mirror reflecting our own challenges and the sometimes messy, unpredictable path of life. Feel free to drop your thoughts and questions in the comments below. What do you think about Jephthe's controversial vow? Was it a tragic mistake made in desperation, or do you see a deeper lesson hidden in that fateful promise? Your experiences and insights can help us all learn more about the complexities of leadership, sacrifice, and the cost of our choices. Let's build a community where we can share and reflect on these timeless lessons together. I also invite you to share your own stories of overcoming rejection or turning adversity into strength. Just as Jephthé rose from being shunned to becoming a leader, each of us has the potential to transform our hardships into a source of power and inspiration. Your journey matters, and by sharing it, you might inspire someone else to see that their past does not have to dictate their future. As we wrap up this deep dive into the life of Jephthé, it's clear that his story is as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago. From the pain of rejection to the heights of leadership, and yes, even the tragic consequences of an impulsive vow, Jephté's life offers us a powerful lesson. Our beginnings do not define us, but the choices we make do. Think about it. Every challenge you face, every moment of doubt or despair, can become the very thing that propels you forward. Jephté's journey from abandoned outcast to respected judge is a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. It shows us that even when our past seems to weigh us down, there's always a chance to rewrite our story and forge a new path. But his life also serves as a cautionary tale. The tragedy of his vow reminds us to be mindful of our promises, especially those made in the heat of the moment. Every decision has its consequences, and sometimes what seems like a desperate measure can lead to lasting regret. It challenges us to pause, reflect, and consider the long-term impact of our choices. So, as you go about your day, I invite you to carry a piece of Jephté's story with you. Let it remind you that while life is unpredictable and often messy, every setback is just a setup for a comeback. Embrace your struggles, learn from your mistakes, and never let anyone else define your worth. Just as Jephthé transformed his rejection into a powerful legacy, you too can find strength in your own journey. If you enjoyed this in-depth exploration of Jephté's life, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with anyone who might find inspiration in his story. And don't forget to leave your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Your voice is an important part of this conversation. Thank you for spending this time with me today as we unpack the highs and lows of Jephté's extraordinary life. May his story remind you that no matter where you start, you have the power to shape your destiny. Stay strong, stay curious, and always remember that every new day is a chance to write a better chapter in your own story. Until next time, keep exploring these timeless lessons hidden in the pages of history, and know that even in our darkest moments, hope is always just a step away. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of Jephthé, a man who, despite a rocky start and a fateful vow, rose to lead his people and left us with a legacy filled with both triumph and tragedy. I hope his story inspires you to look within, to overcome your own challenges, and to realize that every setback is just a stepping stone to something greater. Stay inspired, keep reflecting, and I'll see you in the next Bible story.